Hello, and welcome to Echoes of the Forgotten Earth. A small corner where curiosity can stretch out and settle in, and the biggest questions in the universe are allowed to arrive slowly, without pressure. Tonight's idea is an odd one, but it's the sort of thought that can slip quietly into your mind and linger there long after you first encounter it. It isn't about headlines, breaking discoveries, or whatever happens to be trending in science. It belongs more to those late-night moments when the house is still, the lights are low, and your thoughts wander a little farther than usual. What we're going to explore is this. Was the very first civilization on Earth actually ours? At first, that might sound like the beginning of a science fiction story, something involving aliens, hidden starships, or legendary continents swallowed by the sea. But the question here stays closer to home than that. Picture the history of our planet. Not just the part with people and pyramids, but all of it. Billions of years stretching back into a distance so vast that our entire human saga, every kingdom, every invention, every name you've ever seen in a history book, occupies only the thinnest edge of the timeline. All the rest is filled with oceans and erupting volcanoes, with forests and glaciers, with creatures we'll never meet except as bones or faint impressions in stone. And maybe, just maybe, with something else as well. Something that thought and planned and built long before the first human hand shaped a tool. Before we go too far, I'd like to know where you are in this moment. Are you listening? In the deep quiet of night, with darkness pressed up against the window? Or is sunlight spread across your room, catching on the edges of furniture? Maybe you're moving through the world on a train or a bus, scenery sliding past your window. Or perhaps you're settled into the one chair that always feels like home. Wherever you are, and whatever time it is for you, we're sharing this slice of time together, leaning toward an idea that invites us to picture a world that's gone, a world we can no longer see directly. If this kind of slow, unhurried wandering thought feels like the company you've been wanting, calm, steady, quietly curious, it would mean a lot if you gently nudged it along with a like, a subscription, or by sending it to someone who might need soft questions more than hard answers tonight. It's a small gesture, but it helps these quiet conversations find new listeners, a bit like leaving a light in the window for travelers who are still on the road. So let's begin somewhere simple, with the Earth itself. Not the Earth as we know it now, with airports and highways and city lights, but the Earth before any humans walked across it. No farms, no paved roads, no human voices, just sky, just water, coasts stretching for miles, reshaping themselves over and over again. Entire mountain chains have risen and crumbled back down in the ages before the first human ancestor took a step. If you had a map of the continents from those times, it wouldn't resemble the versions you saw in school. Continents drift slowly over the planet's surface like massive stone rafts, colliding, breaking, submerging, reassembling in new patterns over tens of millions of years. It's tempting to think of this pre-human Earth as empty, as a stage waiting for us. But it wasn't empty at all. It was crowded with life, filling every niche it could find. Some beings swam through the depths, some soared on the air currents, some moved through forests and swamps. Many of them were unlike anything alive now, and a few of them just possibly may have had the first faint beginnings of what we would recognize as intelligence. We often treat human intelligence as a single, special spark that separates us cleanly from all other animals. But intelligence is scattered more widely than we sometimes admit. Crows and parrots can solve puzzles that stump children. Dolphins seem to recognize themselves in mirrors. Octopuses open jars and use tools in ways that look uncannily inventive. That's in our own time, with us sharing the planet. Now imagine a period when intelligence wasn't just a scattered flicker here and there, but became the foundation of something larger, a whole way of life, maybe even a civilization that rose, flourished, and vanished before we were ever here to witness it. The difficulty is this: Earth is not a careful archivist. It holds on to some secrets with surprising loyalty and wipes others away almost as soon as they're written. A city we build today, if left abandoned, will start breaking down within decades. In a few hundred years, plants may have taken over, roofs collapsed, windows shattered. A few thousand years, and even the outlines can blur. Push forward a few million years, and the entire landscape will have sagged and shifted. Rain and wind will have eaten away at concrete and stone. Rivers will have changed course, coastlines will have moved. Even the toughest metals will have corroded, fractured, and been buried under new layers of soil and rock. It isn't that the planet chooses to erase us. It's simply that Earth is always rewriting its surface, layering new stories over old ones. So if another civilization had existed here millions of years ago, would we have any way of knowing? We like to say yes. Our imagination goes straight to archaeologists carefully brushing dust away from pillars and statues, uncovering tools and walls. That approach works for our own history because we're looking back over a very short distance in geological terms. The oldest human-built stone structures we know of are on the order of 12,000 years old, on a planet that's more than 4.5 billion years old. That's not even a blink. If we were trying to find the remains of something that lived, say, 50 million years ago, we'd be searching in rock layers that were still soft sediment back when that hypothetical civilization was thriving. Those layers have since been squeezed, bent, cracked, heated, and sometimes melted. They've been moved far from where they originally formed. The deeper you go in time, the less clearly those layers remember what happened on their surface. This is part of why scientists sometimes talk about what's known as the Silurian hypothesis. The name comes from science fiction, but the question behind it is serious. It asks, if an industrial civilization had once existed on Earth millions of years before humans, could we detect it now in the geological record, even with no surviving artifacts? Would there be odd chemical fingerprints, bands rich in unusual metals, or sudden shifts in atmospheric composition? Possibly. We already know our own industry has left such marks. Our activities are etched into ice cores and seafloor mud. The mid-20th century nuclear tests scattered a thin layer of radioactive isotopes around the globe. Those signatures will linger long after our buildings have weathered away, but they are subtle. You have to know what to look for. And that leads to an unsettling thought. Perhaps we've already walked past the thinnest clues to something older without having any reason to suspect it. A shining vein of metal in a cliff face, a strange mineral mix in an ancient rock layer, cataloged as natural, because natural is the most reasonable assumption. Not because scientists are inattentive, but because the idea of a pre-human technological civilization sits so far outside our usual expectations that it's the last explanation anyone would reach for. Entertaining this possibility doesn't require us to embrace hidden histories or elaborate conspiracies. It's more an exercise in perspective. We like to tell ourselves that we're the first, the only, the apex, but we live on a world whose history is unimaginably long, full of upheavals and reinventions. We know that mass extinctions have repeatedly cleared and reshaped the slate of life. We know ecosystems can bloom and disintegrate in what amounts, geologically, to a moment. We know intelligence is not a single ladder with us perched at the top, but a sprawling, branching tangle that has grown in many directions. So, if there was a civilization before ours, what shape might it have taken? That's the path we'll begin to follow next. For now, it's enough just to hold the idea gently in your mind, to let the deep past become something richer than an empty, untouched wilderness. The continents were not where they are now. The air might have been thicker or thinner, hotter or colder. The animals would have been unfamiliar, their calls unlike any sound we know. And somewhere in that alien world, perhaps there were minds that worked together, shaping their surroundings, creating their own meanings, and then slipped away before we ever got the chance to know they existed. Long before anyone marked a date on a calendar, long before there were clocks or even a concept of numbered years, the Earth was already ancient. By the time the first humans arrived, the planet had already seen billions of dawns and nights. It had smoothed entire mountains down to gentle hills and raised new peaks from the depths of the oceans. The land masses you see outlined on a modern map were not anchored in those familiar places. They drifted slowly across the globe, colliding, tearing themselves apart, gliding over a deep, hot interior like rafts of stone on a sluggish sea of rock. If you could have hovered far above the Earth tens of millions of years ago, the colors might look similar. Blue oceans, green and brown land, white clouds swirling. But the shapes of coastlines and continents would have been strange, the patterns of sea and land unlike any atlas we know. The climate, too, has never been a fixed background. There were ages when warmth and moisture wrapped around most of the globe, when dense forests stretched toward the poles. There were ages when ice expanded so far that even the equator felt its bite. Seas advanced and retreated again and again, swallowing coastal plains and later exposing them once more. Entire biological communities appeared, flourished, and vanished, leaving behind only bits of skeleton and chemical traces for us to puzzle over. The Earth has never been still, and it never will be. In those vast eras, life filled almost every imaginable environment. The dark ocean floors were home to creatures that never saw daylight. Coral reefs grew, died, and reappeared elsewhere. Swamps echoed with the calls of animals we struggle to even picture without fossil reconstructions. On land, forests were made of species of trees whose nearest relatives are gone. Under their canopies, animals of every shape and size moved, hunted, and hid. Insects were among the earliest masters of the land and air, well established long before dinosaurs appeared. Birds evolved from small, feathered dinosaurs and learned how to ride thermals and wind currents above those ancient forests. Mammals were present too, but for much of that time they were small, often nocturnal, keeping to the margins under the shadow of larger neighbors. If you could step into one of those ancient landscapes, you might recognize some basic rules. A tree still reaches toward light. Gravity still pulls water downhill. The wind still stirs leaves and builds storms. The sun continues its climb and fall in the sky. But the details would feel deeply wrong to our senses. The chorus of sounds would be unfamiliar. Some leaves might look nearly right, others would spiral, twist, or fork in ways tuned to climates that no longer exist. Among the animals, you'd see a mix of almost familiar and nothing like anything alive today. Some would be ancestral versions of creatures we know. Others would be evolutionary dead ends. Many would live in groups, herds, flocks, colonies. They would communicate with calls, colors, scents, and gestures that once held clear meaning and now are lost to us. They would hunt, migrate, raise their young, and navigate their worlds with minds suited to their own needs. Some of those minds would be capable of surprisingly complex behavior, even if we might hesitate to call them civilized. And it's here, among all those possibilities, that the question of a pre-human civilization starts to take root. Could one of those lineages have taken a different turn? Could one have begun to reshape its environment, not just to escape danger or find food, but to be more comfortable, more beautiful, more interesting? We know such a turn is possible because it happened with us. Our path from scattered bands of hunter-gatherers to city builders unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years, shaped by climate shifts, geography, competition, and chance. Intelligence didn't appear in an instant. It was molded slowly by survival and adaptation. If another species had the right mix of abilities, problem-solving, sophisticated communication, dexterous manipulation of its surroundings, something like civilization could have started much earlier in Earth's story, in a timeline that ended long before ours began. The difficulty is that the record of those times is fractured. Fossils form only under particular circumstances. Most living things leave nothing of themselves behind. Their bodies are scattered, eaten, or decomposed back into the environment. Even when bones are preserved, they can only whisper to us. From a skull, we can estimate brain size and shape, but not the thoughts that flickered there. We can infer diet and movement and rough lifespan, but not myths, songs, or shared plans. Stone tools and built structures endure better, but only if they are buried quickly and in places shielded from weather and tectonic upheaval for vast stretches of time. Much of the planet's surface has been resurfaced since those ancient days. The crust is not a fixed stage. It is a moving, cracking, recycled shell. Oceans come and go. What was once seafloor becomes mountain. Mountains crumble into sand that is carried, spread, and pressed into new stone elsewhere. Any evidence of a civilization that predated us would have had to survive all of this. Burial, pressure, warping, erosion, subduction. The odds are not in its favor. And even if a fragment did survive, we'd still have to notice it. A tool-shaped stone from tens of millions of years ago without context might be cataloged as an odd natural fracture. A thin layer with strange chemistry in an ancient rock might be attributed to an unusual volcanic episode unless someone went looking with the specific idea of industry in mind. Once you fully absorb the scale of time involved, it becomes much easier to see how an entire chapter of history could be almost completely erased. Imagine a continent clothed in forests, dotted with towns and cities belonging to a species that never met us. Over millions of years, ice ages come and go. Sea levels climb and recede. Glaciers scrape the land bare. Volcanoes bury regions in ash and lava. The crust deforms. In the end, almost everything they built is gone. Perhaps a few stubborn remnants remain. A line of unusual rock deep beneath today's surface, or a strange deposit within an ancient seabed, now stone high in a mountain range. The rest is absence. We do know of special cases where Earth has held onto a scene far longer than usual. Petrified forests where trunks still stand, but are entirely stone. Insects perfectly preserved in amber for tens of millions of years. Footprints pressed in mud and later fossilized as the mud turned to rock. These are rarities, like photographs that accidentally survived a fire. For an entire civilization to be preserved in such a way would require an almost unbelievable stroke of geological luck. Without that, their story would slip into the same silence that has swallowed countless species and lost landscapes before them. Considering this doesn't require us to insist that it happened, it just pries open the door to maybe. And once that door is open, it's hard not to lean closer and ask, if such a civilization did exist, what might it have been like? Would their numbers have been huge, spread across continents, or confined to smaller, scattered communities? Did they build in stone, in wood, in substances that vanish almost as soon as they are abandoned? Did they reshape the land? Or did they move with the changing seasons, leaving light footprints on the world? Would anything they created as art be recognizable to us? Or would it be composed of colors, textures, and patterns that spoke a language only they understood? We don't have answers, but we do have imagination. And imagination is often where real inquiry begins. Scientists don't only work from the evidence they have. They also form hypotheses based on ideas about what evidence might exist if certain things were true. Entertaining the possibility of a pre-human civilization doesn't prove anything. But it changes the kinds of questions we might ask when we look at rocks, sediments, fossils, and anomalies in the data. Earth has worn many faces across its lifetime. Each era has had its own atmosphere, its own arrangements of land and sea, its own web of life. The Earth we inhabit now, with its particular mix of continents, oceans, and ice, is just one version among many. Long before us, where there's now desert, there were jungles. Where we find open ocean, there was once ice. Animals with shapes that would astonish us moved through forests that would look out of place anywhere on the modern planet. Somewhere in all that change, it is not impossible that intelligence rose once before, lived out its time, and disappeared. If it did, the Earth itself is the only witness that remains. Long before we appeared, the planet was anything but quiet. It was full of sounds that belonged entirely to other worlds of experience. Wind rushing through plant life that no longer grows anywhere. deep calls of animals whose only survivors now are a few fragments of bone. Water grinding rock, dripping in caverns, tumbling through river channels across landscapes we would not recognize at all. Somewhere within that constant background of noise and motion, there may have been minds working in ways we would find familiar. Minds that noticed patterns, not just for survival, but out of sheer curiosity. Minds that could hold on to an idea and revisit it, that could imagine outcomes before they happened. Minds that dreamed. We often treat dreaming as something characteristically human, tied to our capacity for stories and for picturing what isn't actually in front of us. But other animals dream. We can see it in the way their brains behave during sleep, in the way dogs paddle their paws as if running, or in the tiny flicks of a bird's closed eyes. Dreaming appears naturally whenever a nervous system reaches a certain level of complexity. It seems to be what brains do when they have enough material to process, weaving memory, expectations, and random impulses into something new. You don't need language in the human sense for that. You don't need cities or books. You just need a brain capable of stitching experience into narratives, even if those narratives are never spoken aloud. If that's true, then countless species before us probably dreamed. Most of those dreams were likely bound tightly to survival, visions of chasing or being chased, of finding shelter, of navigating familiar routes. But it's possible that some minds began taking dreaming further, the way ours did. They might have dreamed of tools, of new ways to reach food, of better ways to protect their offspring. Every generation that uses imagination this way nudges the species a little bit toward changing how it lives. Once you have a mind that can picture something different from what exists right now, you have the seed of invention. The step from picking up a handy object to deliberately shaping a tool for a specific purpose is small in evolutionary time, but enormous in consequence. It means that you're no longer restricted to the environment as you find it. You can start bending it to your advantage. You can build. You can prepare for future events that have not yet occurred. And if those abilities aren't kept locked inside one individual but are shared, taught, imitated, improved, then they can accumulate. Over time, a culture forms, a stockpile of techniques and habits that outlive any particular inventors. We can already see the early stages of this process in some of the species around us. Chimpanzees teach their young how to strip leaves from a stick to use it as a termite fishing tool. Some birds learn how to bend bits of wire into hooks to reach food, and their companions copy them. Dolphins in certain regions develop specialized hunting tricks that spread within that population like local traditions. These are the basic ingredients of culture, and they exist beyond humanity. They show us that intelligence doesn't come in an on-off switch. It's a spectrum, and we occupy one very bright point along it. Not the only point. If we take that understanding and apply it to the deep past, it's not hard to imagine that some branch of the tree of life could have pushed those ingredients much further. Given enough time, a line of animals with good problem-solving, strong social bonds, and effective communication could gradually move from simple tool use to something more like what we call civilization. The difference between cleverness and a city is one of degree, of accumulation, and of stability. For something like civilization to form, conditions have to stay relatively stable for long stretches. Ideas need time to pile up. Techniques must be refined. Knowledge has to spread widely enough that it no longer depends on a handful of individuals to keep it alive. Over millions of years, even a modest start could blossom into something remarkable. So what would it take to trigger that leap? Large brains help, but they don't guarantee the result. Social structure matters. Intelligence grows in a special way when individuals must constantly interpret and anticipate the behavior of others. Communication matters. Being able to share a new insight quickly with many others keeps discoveries from dying out with the innovator. Curiosity matters. A drive to explore beyond immediate needs opens paths evolution alone might never find. In our own case, all of these factors lined up. Social groups, flexible hands, articulate voices, big brains, and a long time to experiment. You can imagine a similar alignment in another lineage, under very different skies, surrounded by very different creatures. We tend to picture intelligence wearing something like our own face, a body standing upright, forward-facing eyes, hands capable of fine movements, a voice able to produce many distinct sounds. But that's just the configuration evolution settled on in our branch. Another intelligent species could be built on completely different foundations. It might live its entire life in water, using fins or tentacles to manipulate its environment. It might be airborne, seeing from above and building lightly on cliffs or treetops. It might be relatively small, depending on numbers and cooperation more than on size and physical strength. Intelligence doesn't demand a particular shape. It finds ways to express itself through whatever form it has available. If such a species had existed, their dreams might have included everything from better hunting methods to safer ways to raise their young, to patterns and performances that we would file under art. They might have told stories without sound, using light, color, motion, or chemistry. They might have decorated their shelters, not out of necessity, but because something in them responded to symmetry or contrast or rhythm. They might have created complex patterns that had no practical purpose at all, simply because it pleased them. That's one of the strangest signs of higher intelligence we know, making things that aren't strictly required to stay alive. Art suggests minds that care about something beyond survival, about beauty, symbolism, or the act of creation itself. Of course, most dreams never leave a mark, even in our own time. Almost everything an individual imagines disappears the moment they wake. Most of what a civilization thinks and feels vanishes with its people. Only a fraction becomes physical, and only a tiny fraction of that survives. To leave behind something that might endure for tens of millions of years, those early dreamers would have needed to build in materials that can withstand the slow grind of time. Stone outlasts wood. Fired clay outlasts woven fibers. Metals can endure for a while, but many will eventually corrode into nothing recognizable. Even then, preservation is not guaranteed. It depends on rapid burial, stable surroundings, and an extraordinary run of luck. Without that, almost everything a civilization produces ends up recycled back into the planet. This is where the challenge becomes clear. Even for our own cities, built with steel, concrete, and plastics, decay begins almost immediately once maintenance stops. Given a couple of centuries, many would be unrecognizable. Given thousands of years, they could be swallowed by forests, deserts, or water. Given 1,000,000, their main effect might show up only as slight differences in soil composition and trace elements. Stretch that out to tens of millions of years, and it's entirely possible that only the most subtle hints would remain. That's why scientists who entertain the notion of an earlier civilization often focus on indirect signs. Instead of hoping for intact ruins, they look, in theory, for oddities in the chemistry of rocks, for abrupt shifts in climate tied to possible industrial activity, for deposits of materials that aren't known to form naturally. These are the geological equivalent of footprints, shallow, partial, and easily blurred, on a very old path. Even those, however, are rare, and natural processes are capable of producing some very strange patterns on their own. Distinguishing the artificial from the natural at that distance in time would be extraordinarily difficult. Still, the thought persists. Somewhere in the deep past, the first minds capable of dreaming as we do might have taken their first deliberate steps toward reshaping the world. Perhaps they began in small scattered bands, surrounded by predators, shifting weather, and an unfamiliar planet. Perhaps they found shelter in caves, built nests or platforms that lasted beyond one season, learned to control fire or some other form of energy. Each new skill would have widened the gap between their way of life and that of the creatures around them. If they eventually reached a point where they could alter the environment on large scales, they might have begun to spread, filling new niches, adapting to new conditions. Some groups might have specialized, trading unique resources or knowledge with others. Over time, dense centers of population and activity may have formed. Not necessarily cities the way we know them, but hubs where ideas, goods, and skills converged. The details are inaccessible to us, but the broad outline of their journey would likely resemble our own, a long, uneven climb toward complexity, punctuated by setbacks, breakthroughs, and periods of relative calm. Whether any of that climb left traces we can still find is another question entirely. The record of life is full of absences, even for creatures we know once existed. Most of the story is missing. What we see are snapshots. That's why this idea resists both proof and disproof. The lack of evidence isn't itself evidence that nothing happened. It's mostly a reflection of how the planet operates. Time erases more than it preserves. We can imagine those first dreaming minds standing in landscapes that have long since been folded into mountains or ground into sand, talking in voices we will never recover. They might have been utterly unlike us in form, or they might have shared more with us than we'd expect. Either way, the possibility that they existed is enough to remind us that our place in history may not be as singular as we tend to believe. Intelligence might be rare, but rare is not the same as unique. Earth may have hosted it before, and it may host it again. From this point, the question becomes less about whether it could have happened and more about what we mean when we use the word civilization in the first place. When we say civilization, we almost automatically picture certain things. Tall stoneworks, broad avenues, elaborate carvings on walls. We picture written laws, organized governments, crowds of people participating in something larger than themselves. Those images come straight from human history. But if we strip the word down to its core, civilization isn't tied to any particular architectural style or political system. At its heart, it describes a way of living in which knowledge, culture, and technology accumulate across generations, and in which that accumulation changes how society functions. By that definition, civilization doesn't have to look impressive from the outside. A group could live in structures made from perishable materials, leaving nothing towering behind, and still be a civilization if they had organized systems, shared learning, and ways of deliberately shaping their surroundings. We notice stone because stone lasts, but durability isn't the real measure. Complexity is. It's also important to remember that civilizations don't have to be vast. We're used to thinking of empires and nation-states because those are the clearest examples in our own past. Yet human civilization began in much smaller, looser networks. Scattered communities linked by trade, stories, and shared practices, without a unified government binding them together. What made them part of a larger pattern was not a capital city or a single leader, but the flow of ideas and skills between them. So if we ask whether there was once a civilization on Earth before humans, we need to keep our definition flexible. It might not resemble Rome or Mesopotamia. It might not have cultivated crops and fields. It might have relied on completely different resources, shaped by the bodies and environments of the species that built it. Even the notion of a city might have looked different, not a dense, permanent cluster of buildings, but perhaps a network of seasonal gathering sites, revisited over and over, linked by paths only they knew. One of the greatest challenges in defining civilization is that we naturally measure it by what we already know. We treat writing as a major milestone, and for us, it certainly is. But writing is just one method of storing and transmitting knowledge. Oral traditions can be rich and precise over long stretches of time. We admire monuments because they endure. But a society could produce works just as sophisticated in forms that vanish quickly. Intricate woodwork, woven architectures, or even living designs grown from plants. We marvel at large engineering projects, but small, precise modifications to an environment can be equally telling signs of advanced organization. If a non-human civilization lived here millions of years ago, their way of life might not fit comfortably into our categories. They might never have herded animals, built walls, or fired bricks. They might never have smelted metal. Their tools could have been entirely organic, crafted in ways that leave almost no trace once decay does its work. In that case, their existence would most likely show up not as walls or artifacts, but as patterns, altered watercourses, unusual distributions of plants, or soil layers that bear the marks of repeated deliberate disturbance. This is why our definition matters so much. If we limit civilization to things that look like our ruins, we almost guarantee that we'll miss other possibilities. If we broaden it to mean any long-lasting, organized way of life that modifies the environment and passes knowledge forward, we open ourselves to seeing more. That doesn't mean we should label every complex animal society as a civilization. Ant colonies and beehives are intricate, but they operate largely on inherited instinct rather than on cumulative cultural change. The crucial difference lies in innovation that builds on itself. Not just behavior encoded in genes, but skills and ideas learned, taught, and improved over time. Archaeologists, when they try to decide whether a past human group belonged to a civilization, look for certain things: long-distance trade, specialized roles, symbolic expression, and the ability to support larger communities than a simple extended family. None of those require stone temples or metal plows. They require organization, cooperation, and shared culture. Those markers could, in principle, show up in the fossil and sediment record of another species. But without direct artifacts, spotting them would be extraordinarily hard. There's also the matter of duration. How long does a civilization need to exist before we consider it significant? Some human societies have lasted for thousands of years. Others burned brightly and collapsed within a few centuries. On the scale of geology, even 1,000 years is barely noticeable. But in that flicker, a civilization can transform the surface, clearing forests, diverting rivers, moving species around the globe. Sometimes, we can detect these changes long after the physical structures are gone, by reading seeds and pollen in the soil, by studying layers of sediment. If a pre-human civilization persisted long enough to reshape ecosystems on a large scale, we might expect to find similar echoes, even if we didn't immediately recognize them as artificial. The difficulty, always, is that nature is capable of creating patterns that look deliberate. A perfect circular hill might be a volcanic cone, not an ancient raised platform. Straight lines can appear in rock through fracturing and erosion. Shifts in plant composition might follow changes in climate rather than cultivation. So to make a convincing case for civilization, we would need convergence. Multiple lines of evidence reinforcing one another. Alterations in landscape, strange materials, and perhaps fossil clues pointing to a species with an unusual way of life. And that brings up another unknown. What would those beings have looked like? We often assume that a species needs limbs like our hands, or perhaps flexible tentacles, to build complex tools and machines. It's true that our own technology is shaped by the fine control our fingers give us. But another kind of civilization might have grown from a different set of abilities. Perhaps they worked with large-scale structures more than small tools, shaping entire environments with their bodies. Perhaps they were aquatic, using currents and chemistry rather than hammers and chisels. Perhaps they flew, building lightly and temporarily, relying on memory more than on permanent architecture. The challenge of defining civilization is part of what makes the question of its possible recurrence so interesting. It forces us to step outside the familiar and imagine worlds organized on principles we haven't seen before, or at least haven't recognized. It reminds us that our particular path is just one out of many the universe might allow, and that the rules we assume are universal may simply be the customs of one species at one moment in time. Even now, looking at life around us, we can spot hints of the roads not taken. Elephants dig water holes and push down trees, changing the landscape in ways that persist long after they've moved on. Some birds construct elaborate structures to impress mates. Those structures can be used and added to season after season. Whales sing songs that travel across basins, changing slowly over years. None of these quite cross the threshold into what we call civilization, but they stand close to its edge. In different circumstances, given more time, different pressures, and perhaps a bit of evolutionary luck, those edges might be crossed. Once we accept that civilization might not always resemble ours, the next natural question is, how would we even begin to search for it in the deep past? We would not start with the expectation of finding cleanly carved temples or intact streets. We would start with oddities, small deviations in the geological and fossil record that don't immediately fit known patterns. We would need geologists, paleontologists, chemists, and climate scientists comparing notes, revisiting data, and asking whether any of the anomalies we currently attribute to unknown natural causes might instead be the faint fingerprints of something deliberate. It would be slow, careful work, and most likely natural explanations would win out, again and again. But even that process would deepen our understanding of how the Earth behaves on its own. And if, in the midst of that effort, we found something that truly resisted being folded back into the ordinary, we might have our first real hint that intelligence has bloomed here more than once. Given billions of years and a restless planet, it wouldn't be the strangest thing that ever happened. When most people picture digging into the deep past, they imagine a paleontologist crouched over a nearly complete skeleton, brushing away the last bits of soil to reveal a creature almost intact, as if it simply lay down and went to sleep. Reality is gentler and far more fragile. Most of what has ever lived is gone without leaving a single visible trace. What does remain tends to come down to us in fragments, partial bones, distorted impressions, chemistry altered by age and pressure. The scientists who study these traces behave less like treasure hunters and more like translators faced with a damaged text. The Earth has been writing its story for hundreds of millions of years in a language composed of minerals and molecules shaped by heat, compression, and time. A fossil isn't a preserved piece of the past in any minerals carried in water. Sometimes all we get is a mold of the outer shape, a cast of where the object used to be. Sometimes it's just a ripple in what was once mud, a footprint, a tail drag, a raindrop pattern frozen before it could be disturbed. Just as often, nothing forms at all. The remains are broken up, scattered, or dissolved before the conditions for fossilization have a chance to arise. That's why the fossil record is so incomplete. Whole species, entire thriving lineages, can live and vanish without ever leaving behind even a single specimen for us to find. The conditions that allow fossils to form are rare and tend to cluster in certain environments: river mouths, lake bottoms, ash-covered landscapes, and deep seas where sediment piles up quickly. By contrast, bones left on open ground, in fast eroding hills, or along shifting coasts are almost certain to disappear without a trace. Our view of the past, then, is built from scattered pieces gathered from the places that happened to preserve them. For someone trying to detect signs of a civilization that lived and died millions of years ago, that patchiness becomes a huge obstacle. Even in the short span of human history, our footprint is uneven. Settlements in deserts or arid highlands can leave stubborn traces, while towns along ancient coasts may now be submerged or eroded beyond recognition. Stretch the timescale out to tens of millions of years, and you can begin to see how an entire saga could simply fail to register. If a technologically capable society once flourished on what is now ocean floor, its remains could be buried beneath miles of water and mud, locked into crust that eventually sinks back into the mantle. If it lived in a region later scraped by ice or uplifted and ground down, the very land that held its works could be reshaped beyond recognition. The people who sift through the Earth's layers know this intimately. Every find is a rare point on a map drawn mostly from empty space. They're aware that what we know about the past is skewed toward the creatures and places that fossilize well. They also understand that sometimes the most revealing evidence is tiny. A single tooth can hint at diet and lineage. A narrow band of pollen in a core sample can reveal what kind of forest once grew above. Subtle chemical signatures in rock point toward global events, eruptions, asteroid impacts, or abrupt climate flips. It's those chemical clues that might also carry whispers of something else, a disturbance that doesn't quite fit the usual natural categories. Our own industrial era is already altering the planet in ways that will be legible long after we're gone. The atmospheric carbon we're releasing is changing the ratio of carbon isotopes recorded in wood, ice, and marine sediments. Our mining and manufacturing spread rare elements and synthetic compounds across the globe. Radioactive isotopes from nuclear activities create a layer that will remain detectable far into the future. If someone were to study rocks laid down in our time millions of years from now, they might see a very thin, very odd layer, rich in certain metals, strange molecules, and isotope ratios, unlike anything above or below it. Natural processes can produce their own unusual layers. Supervolcanoes can load the atmosphere with ash and sulfur. Massive die-offs can leave bands rich in organic carbon. Changes in currents can rearrange sediments over huge distances. The scientists who keep their ears to this fossil whisper weigh all of those possibilities before they even consider invoking something as extraordinary as an ancient civilization. In science, extraordinary hypotheses demand extraordinarily solid evidence. Yet there are rock layers where the story isn't straightforward. In some strata, we find rapid shifts in mineral content or chemistry that suggest a sudden introduction of unusual materials. Most are explained eventually by known events: a volcano, an impact, a dramatic shift in ocean chemistry. A few remain puzzling. Those puzzles are not proof. They are simply places where the narrative isn't complete. They leave room, however small, for the question, what if? What? If there was another hand at work once, reshaping the planet in ways beyond what we've cataloged, it wouldn't necessarily announce itself with a giant fossilized skyline. It might appear as a cluster of odd mineral deposits hinting at mining on a grand scale, or as a thin layer of material that doesn't match any known volcanic or cosmic source. Interpreting such signs would require not only detailed data, but a willingness to ask questions that sit far outside our usual expectations. There's a certain patience demanded by this kind of inquiry. Piecing together the deep past isn't about finding one spectacular artifact and declaring victory. It's about slowly assembling multiple independent lines of evidence until they begin to form a coherent picture, or accepting that the picture may remain incomplete. In the case of a possible civilization, long predating humanity, the picture might never be more than fragmentary. Hints that refuse to disappear, yet never resolve into certainty. That uncertainty is part of what makes the idea so haunting. We live in an age where it's easy to believe we can eventually map everything. Every gene, every galaxy, every corner of the past. But the truth is that our understanding of Earth's deep history is thin. The fossil record isn't a full narrative. It's a set of saved scenes from a very long film. Most reels missing. Many frames damaged or mislabeled. What it does tell us is that life has been stranger and more diverse than our intuition might suggest. Entire branches of the evolutionary tree have grown, branched, and vanished, leaving only a few twigs behind. The world we know now is just the latest version in a long succession. In that context, the notion of another civilization whose remains have been almost completely smudged away doesn't seem impossible. If it lived in an environment where preservation was unlikely, if it used materials that decay rapidly, if its numbers were relatively small or its impact relatively concentrated, then its physical traces could easily be as sparse as the record of many lesser-known species. The researchers who work with deep time are aware of this. It shapes their sense of what can and cannot be known. Every layer of rock, every core pulled from the sea floor, every cross-section of sediment is like a worn page. You can make out some of the words, guess others, and see where entire paragraphs have been ripped out. Reading that record requires skill, patience, and something less tangible: imagination. The ability to see how a faint line might connect to others, how an odd pattern might fit into a larger story, without straying too far from what the data allows. Occasionally, to make progress, it also requires entertaining possibilities that sound unlikely, at least at first. That doesn't mean jumping to conclusions. It means leaving a little room in the mind for the unknown, for the chance that the Earth's long memory still holds surprises we haven't yet learned how to notice. From there, it becomes natural to ask another question. How does the planet itself decide what to remember and what to let go? And what forces are powerful enough to erase almost all signs of something once real? Earth's memory doesn't work the way ours does. We store moments, vivid flashes, emotions, details we can call up again. The planet stores processes. Its recollections are written in rock, ice, and mud, laid down in slow layers that record patterns rather than individual scenes. It builds its archive grain by grain, year by year. but it also rewrites constantly, crushing, heating, and transforming older pages as new ones accumulate on top. There's no sentiment to it, no effort to preserve something because it was beautiful or meaningful. The crust shifts, because that's what crust does. If we could peel back the planet's outer shell like the pages of an impossibly thick book, we'd see not a continuous record, but a story with huge gaps, long stretches of time missing, not because nothing happened, but because the mechanisms that reshape the surface are relentless. Mountains thrust up where plates collide, then slowly weather down under wind and rain. Oceans spread as plates pull apart, then close again as land converges. Lava blankets old landscapes, sealing them away. Ice drags across continents like a slow blade, scraping the surface clean. Even gentle forces, a river changing course, a shoreline moving inland, bury old terrains and expose new ones. The landscapes we see today are not the same ones that existed 1,000,000 years ago, or 10, or 100. In some places, rocks at the surface may have formed relatively recently. In others, very old rocks have been so altered by heat and pressure that any original details have been blurred beyond recognition. This constant recycling means that the older a trace is, the less likely it is to survive in an interpretable state. For the remnants of a civilization to persist beyond tens of millions of years, they would need exceptional luck to end up in a geologically calm region, protected from subduction, major erosion, and extreme metamorphism. Even then, heat and pressure could distort them beyond easy recognition. Organic remains vanish quickly unless sealed off from air and moisture. Many do not last even a few thousand years. This is why our knowledge of Earth's earliest chapters is so sketchy. The first 1,000,000,000 years or so of the planet's story is represented by a handful of stubborn rocks in a few locations. They offer clues about conditions, but almost nothing like a full picture. The same basic principle applies as we move forward through time. The further back we look, the more we're piecing together outlines rather than details. And it's not only geology at work. Biology and climate act as erasers as well. A forest can reclaim and conceal an entire city in mere decades. Vines pry apart walls, roots break foundations, soil builds up over floors. Insects and microbes dismantle paper, leather, and wood. Metal dissolves in salty air or water. Even stone, given enough time, succumbs. Water seeps into cracks, freezes, expands, and loosens pieces. Chemical reactions slowly dissolve minerals. Plants push their way through, splitting and toppling blocks. On human scales of time, ruins may seem eternal. On planetary scales, they're brief interruptions. If humanity vanished tomorrow, the most obvious traces of our presence, roads, towers, bridges, would already be fading by the next century. Within 10,000 years, many would be gone or buried. In 1,000,000, scattered hints would be all that remained, hidden in sediments or as subtle variations in soil. After 10 million years, a future geologist might be able to see that a river once ran a straighter course than nature alone would suggest, or that certain elements are oddly concentrated in a particular layer. But the coherent picture of cities and machines would be gone. That's what makes searching for very ancient history so daunting. We aren't hunting for intact artifacts. We're looking for fragments that have survived a chain of destructive processes, often stripped of their original context. And we have to accept that for enormous swaths of time, the record will be incomplete to the point of silence. Whole continents, entire ecosystems, and any civilizations they hosted could have come and gone without leaving evidence robust enough to endure. Even the ocean floor isn't a permanent storage space. The crust beneath the deep sea is constantly renewed and recycled. In most places, it's younger than 200 million years. Anything older than that has already been drawn down into the mantle and re-emerged as new rock stripped of whatever it once held. Land can preserve older rocks, but land too is worn down and rebuilt over and over. Continents shift position, altering both climate and erosion patterns. This ongoing turnover is a central reason the fossil record has so many gaps. It's not that life was absent during those times. It's that the conditions didn't favor long-term preservation. If you think of the Earth as a library, it's one where many of the oldest volumes have been torn apart, their pages mashed into pulp, and then used to make newer books. A few scattered leaves from the originals are all that remain. Those few pages are what science works with. When a fossil survives in good condition, it's because a lot of things went exactly right. Quick burial, protection from scavengers, a stable environment, the right balance of minerals and groundwater. The same would have to be true for any artifact of a civilization. It would require not only to be created, but to land in precisely the sort of situation where it could endure, and to stay there undisturbed for unimaginable stretches of time. Even then, our ability to recognize it is not guaranteed. A stone shaped by hands could be mistaken for one shaped by water and fracture. An odd mineral lens might be written off as an unusual natural deposit. Without a cluster of related clues pointing to the same conclusion, a single out-of-place object is unlikely to shift the consensus of what we think is possible. That's why thinking about the planet's memory alters how we approach the idea of a lost civilization. It isn't enough to imagine what they might have built. We also have to imagine what will be left after the Earth has had its way with their world for tens or hundreds of millions of years. We need to picture how their monuments, tools, and refuse would interact with the forces of tectonics, erosion, chemistry, and biology. We have to ask ourselves what forms of evidence are resilient enough to survive, and in what altered state. And we have to accept that most of what they were would simply be gone. What does remain, when it does, is usually in the language of chemistry and microstructure. Trapped gases in tiny bubbles, isotopes frozen in minerals, microscopic fossils in layers of sediment. These are the scraps of memory that slip through the constant revision. They're incomplete, but they're also precious because they give us any connection at all to times we'll never witness. And that, more than anything, is why we cannot be fully certain what Earth has or hasn't hosted. If the planet is capable of erasing almost everything our own civilization has done in a few million years, then it could just as easily have done the same to others. Its memory is long, but selective. What it chooses, or is able, to keep, is only a small fraction of what has been. If there were others before us, beings who thought, shaped, and disappeared, whatever is left of them now would be faint. Perhaps so faint that we've already looked straight at it without knowing what we were seeing. That possibility naturally leads to another. If others did exist, who were they? What kind of life could have taken on that role long before we did? When we think of the great age of reptiles, most of us summon images from museum halls or films. Massive predators with jaws full of teeth, long-necked giants lumbering through swamps, armored herbivores swinging heavy tails like living wrecking balls. It's a vision ruled by size and spectacle, a world where sheer bulk seems to dominate everything. But the reign of the dinosaurs spanned more than 160 million years. In all that time, there was space for far more than just the giants. There were opportunities for small, agile creatures, for quick thinkers, for animals that depended as much on coordination and cunning as on strength. If we're going to speculate about a civilization that predates our own, the Mesozoic era naturally comes to mind. Not because we picture tyrannosaurs laying bricks, but because evolution had an enormous amount of time to try out different ideas then. The diversity of life was enormous. The skies held pterosaurs capable of gliding long distances. The oceans were stocked with powerful marine reptiles. On land, dinosaurs came in every scale from chicken size to bus length. Among them existed small, lightly built forms with comparatively large brains for their size. Brain size alone doesn't tell the whole story of intelligence, but there is a pattern. In many living animals, species with higher brain-to-body ratios tend to show more flexible behaviors and better problem solving. Some of the smaller theropod dinosaurs, especially those close to the lineage that led to birds, had brains that, relative to their bodies, were not so far off from modern birds. They likely saw well, moved with precision, and in some cases may have hunted in coordinated groups or cared for their young at communal nesting sites, These are the kinds of traits that, given enough evolutionary time, could form the foundation for more complex social behavior. Modern birds, descendants of those dinosaurs, give us a hint of what might have been possible. Crows, ravens, and parrots solve puzzles, use tools, and pass tricks along to their peers. They can hold grudges and recognize individual human faces. If present-day birds can do this in a relatively short evolutionary window, it's not absurd to imagine that some of their ancestors might have matched or surpassed them in some respects. The problem is that the subtle aspects of intelligence rarely fossilize. A fossil skull can tell us how big a brain was and roughly how it was shaped, but not how its owner dealt with the world. Trackways can hint at group movement. Nests and egg clutches can show parental care. But communication, planning, and teaching are behaviors that leave almost no direct marks in stone. Even if a lineage of particularly clever dinosaurs existed, the gap between individual intelligence and full-blown civilization is immense. To bridge it, physical anatomy also matters. Dinosaurs, as far as we can tell, didn't have anything like human hands. Some had grasping claws, and birds have deft beaks and feet, but shaping small, intricate tools the way we do might have been difficult. That doesn't make technology impossible. It just means their technology, if it existed, would have looked very different. They might have focused on large-scale constructions, using their bodies to move earth and stone. They might have taken advantage of natural structures, caves, cliffs, tree stands, enhancing them modestly rather than building from scratch. If such a civilization ever existed, it's tempting to picture settlements in sheltered valleys, along rivers, or on coastal plains. Their homes might have been formed from mud, woven branches, or stone, perhaps raised off the ground or arranged in patterns we would now mistake for purely geological features. Their art, if they had it, might not appear as carved statues or paint on walls. It could have been temporary displays of feathers, stones carefully arranged in open spaces, or patterns scratched into soft surfaces that eroded away long ago. The same preservation problem returns. Organic materials are quick to vanish. Stone can last, but only if circumstances cooperate. And since the time of the non-avian dinosaurs, the continents have drifted, sea levels have risen and fallen, mountains have come and gone. Most surfaces from that time have been heavily modified. Any structures they built would have had to survive burial, compression, and tectonic movement over roughly 66 million years or more. The odds are not kind. What we do know is that the Mesozoic left us birds, highly successful, highly adaptable, and in some cases impressively intelligent. Whether that intelligence ever approached something civilization-like in any dinosaur lineage is a question we may never be able to answer. We also carry a bias. Because mammals dominate the land today, we tend to see dinosaurs as somehow less advanced, as if their time was a rough draft and ours the finished version. But during their era, mammals were mostly small and marginal. Dinosaurs filled almost every major land niche. If advanced intelligence had a chance to arise during that time, the smart money would have been on them. If it did, its legacy might persist not in buildings, but in inherited behaviors among their descendants, in the cleverness of corvids and parrots, in the instincts of birds that migrate with astonishing precision. Even if no dinosaur lineage ever crossed the line into civilization, their story shows us something important. Complex thought can evolve in very different bodies and under very different conditions than our own. It's a reminder that the capacity for rich mental life isn't tied to a specific body plan or environment. It's an opportunity evolution can seize whenever circumstances are right. Thinking along those lines leads naturally away from the land altogether and toward a realm where intelligence has arisen multiple times in our own epoch: the oceans. If the continents are constantly being broken and rearranged, the oceans are an even more mysterious archive. They cover most of the planet's surface, conceal the highest mountains and the deepest trenches, and sustain entire worlds that sunlight never touches. For all our satellites and maps, what lies beneath the waves is still poorly known. We've charted coastlines, shipping routes, and shallow shelves, but much of the deep ocean remains explored only by instruments, not by human eyes. If a civilization once developed down there, its story might still be largely hidden. On the timeline of life, the oceans came first. Complex organisms swam and crawled through salt water for hundreds of millions of years before the first trees rooted into land. Even after forests spread and land animals diversified, the seas kept hosting their own evolutionary experiments. Today, some of the most sophisticated brains on Earth belong to marine creatures. Dolphins and whales exhibit social structures, communication, and problem-solving abilities that stand beside primates in complexity. Certain octopus species can navigate mazes, manipulate objects, and show individual personalities. If intelligence of that caliber has appeared more than once in the oceans in the relatively short era humans have been around, it raises a clear question. What might have happened if one of those lineages had millions upon millions of years to develop without us ever existing? The oceans, in some ways, are more stable than the land. No ice sheets plow across the deep seafloor. Tectonic movement does replace oceanic crust, but the water itself remains a continuous medium where life can find shelter during surface upheavals. For an intelligent marine species, that could mean long, uninterrupted stretches of time to discover and refine technologies suited to water. Our own concept of technology leans heavily on things that don't play well at depth: fire, dry materials, and air-breathing engines. But tools don't have to look like ours. A marine civilization might work with coral, stone, shell, and living tissue. It might cultivate reefs for both shelter and food, sculpting them deliberately over generations. It might manage kelp forests like underwater orchards. Its structures could be anchored to the seafloor, built into cliffs, or suspended in midwater by carefully balanced buoyancy. Light would be precious in deeper waters, so they might rely on sound or bioluminescence to communicate and organize. Whales already send low-frequency calls across vast distances. Many oceanic organisms already produce light. It's not hard to imagine a language composed of pulses of sound and patterns of glow, perfectly adapted to travel through water. The physical traces of such a civilization would have a hard time lasting. Organic materials decay quickly in most marine environments, especially near the surface. Stone formations can crumble in currents and can be buried by sediment. To make matters harder, the ocean floor itself is relatively young. As oceanic crust is created at undersea ridges and moves outward, it eventually sinks back into the mantle at subduction zones. The oldest seafloor on Earth is about 200 million years old, which sounds like a lot until you remember the planet is more than 4.5 billion years old. Any ocean-based civilization older than that would have had its home ground literally destroyed and recycled from below. Still, not all of its traces would necessarily vanish. In shallow seas near continents, where the seafloor can later rise to become dry land, fragments might endure. We already find ancient marine fossils high in mountains, remnants of oceans that disappeared ages ago. If an aquatic civilization ever built modest structures or altered coastal environments, some of those changes could be preserved in rock layers that are above sea level today, buried beneath sediments, waiting for erosion or excavation to uncover them. Chemical clues could also linger. Large-scale farming or construction in the ocean might alter nutrient levels, sediment composition, or trace element distributions in ways that leave signals in the geological record. We've already seen human activity do this. Fertilizers change nitrogen patterns. Industrial processes distribute heavy metals. Microscopic plastics now settle into ocean sediments almost everywhere. Over very long timescales, plastics might break down, and many industrial chemicals might transform. But the patterns of change in certain isotopes and elemental concentrations could remain, a quiet indication that something once manipulated the ocean in a concerted way. Fossils of the intelligent species themselves are another possibility, but again, preservation and recognition are problems. A marine animal with no bones, or with only soft cartilage, may leave little behind. Even if some hard parts fossilize, there is no guarantee we would recognize them as belonging to a mind capable of culture and tools. We might simply categorize such fossils as another extinct marine form, interesting but not obviously special. Thinking about an underwater civilization also forces us to loosen our grip on familiar ideas. Many of our assumptions about cities and agriculture depend on surfaces, fields, and gravity as we know it. Underwater, resources are layered vertically as well as horizontally. Light, pressure, temperature, and currents create a three-dimensional patchwork of habitats. For a marine culture, migration routes, upwelling zones, and thermal layers might take the place of roads, borders, and farmlands. Gathering in large numbers might only be practical at certain places and times. Permanence might matter less than pattern. They might have no need for rigid, long-lasting structures in the way we think of buildings. Their cities could be periodic congregations marked more by shared behavior than by architecture. Their records might be stored in acoustic patterns, ritualized songs, or genetically encoded behaviors rather than in carved or written media. If they ever ventured onto land, perhaps as briefly as seals, or more extensively in amphibious forms, they might have harvested resources from beaches and cliffs, stacking stones or arranging objects that, after their disappearance, would be easy to mistake for natural features. Storms and waves would wear down anything left on shore. Currents would disperse constructed forms in shallow water. Geological uplift and subsidence would rework coastlines. After enough time, only subtle anomalies might remain. Strange shell middens, shaped rock in odd locations, or unusual sediment layers. The oceans have always held both abundance and danger. Food is plentiful, but so are predators. Conditions can change rapidly. For any species hoping to build something lasting there, understanding patterns and adapting quickly would be essential. Social bonds would matter. Long-term memory would matter. The ability to pass knowledge down through generations would matter. In those respects, the lives of intelligent marine beings wouldn't be so different from our own. If such a civilization ever existed, its disappearance would likely be even harder to detect than that of a land-based society. The medium that supported it would also be the one that dismantled and obscured its traces. Whatever remained would be faint, a chemical oddity in a sediment core, an unusual fossil, a rearranged stretch of ancient coastal rock. And yet, the seas are patient. They have been a cradle for life since the beginning. They have already produced multiple lineages of animals with sophisticated cognition. If they can do that within the narrow time frame in which humans have observed them, it's not unreasonable to imagine they might have done so before, in ways we've never dreamed. From here, speculation brings us back ashore. Not to the dominant giants, but to the quieter candidates. The overlooked creatures that might have found their own path to complexity without ever towering over their ecosystems. The animals that capture our imagination when we think of prehistory tend to be the ones with dramatic skeletons, massive horns, saber-like teeth, imposing tusks. They're the ones that look good standing in museum galleries. But the true drivers of ecological change are often far smaller. Builders of burrows, engineers of forests, creatures that move soil, seeds, and nutrients in subtle ways. If any forgotten civilization existed on land, it might have belonged not to giants, but to such in-between animals, big enough to manipulate their environment, small enough to be overlooked by the broad sweep of our storytelling. We could call them, in our imagination, the forgotten builders. They wouldn't necessarily have dominated every habitat or towered over their neighbors. Instead, they might have excelled at cooperation, at shaping the places they lived, at passing on knowledge. They could have thrived in environments with predictable resources, river valleys, stable forests, sheltered coastal plains, where survival pressures allowed room for experimentation. Intelligence doesn't always evolve in the obvious places. It often grows quietly in corners where life is secure enough to grant time for wondering and trying new things. When we look at the living world, we see hints of this. Beavers dam rivers, creating ponds and wetlands that change entire landscapes. Birds like weaver finches construct intricate nests that show regional variations, almost like architectural styles. Some primates develop complex tool traditions. Termites and ants build vast underground networks and towering mounds with built-in ventilation. None of these societies meets all of our criteria for civilization, but they demonstrate how environmental engineering, problem-solving, and social complexity can arise independently in many groups. If we imagine a forgotten builder species in the deep past, it might have combined several of these traits. dexterous limbs capable of detailed work, brains tuned for planning, social structures that foster teaching and learning. What they constructed might have been made mostly out of plant fibers, clay, and soil, materials that vanish quickly once abandoned. They could have dug extensive underground shelters, terraced hillsides, diverted streams, or tended particular plant species. After millions of years, erosion, vegetation, and tectonics would likely erase or obscure most of these modifications. What might survive would be the faintest hints, unusual soil layers, patterns of sediments that don't quite match the local climate record, or odd distributions of plant fossils suggesting cultivation or deliberate spreading. But again, nature is restless. Rivers meander, landslides bury valleys, storms rearrange sediments. Animals spread seeds without any plan. Predators and scavengers create bone piles that can look like ritual deposits. Separating deliberate design from accident at such a distance in time would be extraordinarily difficult. There's another complication: our own tendency to read intelligence through a human lens. We measure cognitive complexity in terms of things we value: spoken language, visual art, written records, mechanical tools. But a forgotten builder civilization might have channeled intelligence into different directions. Elaborate oral histories never recorded physically, mental maps of territory passed down in story form, or complex spiritual practices that left almost no material trace. Their greatest achievements could have been intangible, anchored in consciousness and community rather than in stone or metal. When they disappeared, those achievements would have gone with them. It's even possible that some modern species we see as ordinary are the descendants of ancestors who once exhibited much more elaborate behaviors. Evolution doesn't only move forward toward complexity, it also simplifies when conditions push in that direction. Traits that were once advantageous can be lost if they become too costly. An intelligent species might have reduced in brain size and behavioral scope if it found a niche where simpler strategies worked better. In that case, we'd be looking at descendants that gave us no obvious reason to suspect an extraordinary past. Competition could have played a role too. If the Forgotten Builders shared their era with other adaptable species, they might have been pushed into decline by rivals better suited to changing conditions. Their culture, no matter how impressive, wouldn't protect them indefinitely from climate shifts, disease, or new predators. We can see something like this in our own history. Human cultures, languages, and technologies have vanished under the pressure of invasion, environmental change, or collapse. Whole ways of life, once rich and complex, have been reduced to a handful of artifacts and references. Scale that process up to the stretches of geologic time, and it's not hard to see how an entire civilization could leave little behind. If such builders existed, their ingenuity might have taken forms we would never think to look for. Domesticated species now extinct, altered ecosystems that later rebalanced, landscapes tuned so subtly that their modifications blended back into nature once the builders were gone. In their time, they might have been as innovative and far-reaching as we are. To them, their way of life would have felt as permanent and central as ours does to us. The thought that entire civilizations could rise and fall without leaving clear, durable traces can be a little dizzying, but it also invites humility. It reminds us that the human story, rich as it is, sits in a much bigger context. Intelligence and culture may have flared up in many forms across Earth's history, each one believing it was the main event, each one eventually handed back to the planet's slow, impartial processes. Speculating about such predecessors doesn't just change how we look backward, it also shifts how we search. Instead of focusing only on obvious ruins, we might train ourselves to pay attention to subtler patterns, unusual chemical signatures, inexplicable shifts in fossils, landscape features that don't quite match known natural processes. We might ask more often, could this be deliberate, while still demanding strong evidence before we call it so? And if we accept that something like civilization could have existed on land without leaving towering monuments, it becomes easier to imagine similar stories unfolding in other environments, on high plateaus, in isolated basins, or in regions that are now buried or submerged. All of which leads us to another tool, looking for traces in the tiniest of places, in the layers of sediment that quietly accumulate and preserve records invisible to the naked eye. When we think of the physical remnants of the past, it's natural to picture the obvious ones. Bones arranged in a museum case, stone axes behind glass, fragments of pottery still bearing traces of painted patterns. But most of the history of life isn't preserved in such dramatic pieces. It's stored in much smaller details, pressed into the layers of sediment that slowly accumulate in rivers, lakes, seas, and low-lying land. In a sense, the sediment itself is the archive. Every grain of sand, every speck of silt, every wafer-thin band of clay is a line in a book that took thousands or millions of years to write. As with any old manuscript, some lines are crisp, some are smudged, and some have been scraped away and written over. Sediment is constantly forming almost everywhere. Rivers grind down rock and carry it downstream. Waves erode coastlines. Dust blows in from deserts. Dead plants and animals settle onto the bottom of lakes and oceans. Over time, these materials pile up in layers. If those layers are buried quickly and remain relatively undisturbed, they can survive for incredibly long periods. In them, we find not just the remains of organisms, but also the chemical fingerprints of the environments they lived in. To someone trained to read it, a thick band of coarse gravel might tell of a fast, powerful river that once roared through. A thin, smooth sheet of fine mud could suggest a quiet lake bottom or a calm stretch of seafloor. Alternating light and dark layers might mark yearly cycles, echoing the way tree rings track seasons. Often, sediment carries microfossils, tiny shells from plankton, grains of pollen from ancient forests, spores from vanished ferns and mosses. These are tougher than they look and can last for tens of thousands, even millions of years. By examining which pollen grains appear and in what amounts, scientists can reconstruct past vegetation and, from that, infer climate. A sudden surge in one type of pollen might indicate that a certain plant species became unusually common. A rapid decline could mean it disappeared from that region. This is where the idea of a lost civilization intersects with the work of paleobotanists and geochemists. Our own societies leave undeniable marks in sediment. Agriculture changes which plants dominate, altering the pollen record. Clearing forests for fields or fuel can lead to increased erosion, filling lakes and rivers with more sediment than before. Mining and metallurgy sprinkle traces of metals over wide areas. Modern industry is now depositing microscopic plastics and synthetic chemicals almost everywhere. If a past civilization carried out large-scale farming, deforestation, or industrial activity, similar shifts might appear in ancient sediment layers. But nature also produces many of these signals on its own. Volcanic eruptions can blanket vast regions in ash, altering soil and water chemistry. Climate shifts can wipe out some plant communities and allow others to spread. Changes in ocean circulation can change which plankton thrive, altering the microscopic shell record in seafloor mud. A dark layer rich in carbon might indicate widespread burning. But was that caused by lightning-sparked wildfires or by deliberate land clearing? To answer questions like that, scientists look for patterns and correlations. If a layer shows an unusual chemical composition, they ask, does the pollen record change at the same time? Is there evidence in nearby sediments of repeated fires, altered erosion, or sudden shifts in animal remains? If multiple lines of evidence point to the same conclusion, vegetation change, increased charcoal, strange metal concentrations, then a picture begins to form. Even then, certainty is elusive, especially as we look further back. Layers can represent long spans of time rather than precise moments. Over millions of years, pressure and subtle chemical reactions can blur or reshape the original signals. Sediment can be reworked, carried away and redeposited elsewhere, making it hard to know exactly where and when certain materials were first laid down. Still, the potential remains. If an ancient civilization carried out activities on a scale comparable to ours, especially if it used large amounts of energy or transformed large areas of land, we might expect to see some echo of that in sediment cores, particularly in regions that have been geologically stable for a long time. The key challenge is finding those pockets of stability and reading their layers with enough precision to separate ordinary environmental change from something stranger. We already have a preview of what our own layer will look like. In sediments laid down over the last century or two, there are sharp increases in certain metals near industrial centers, traces of fossil fuel combustion, and radioactive isotopes from nuclear tests. Even in remote lakes and Arctic ice, you can see the faint signatures of human activity carried by air and water. Millions of years from now, those traces might be reduced and altered but not erased. There will still be a detectable blip just where we are, a thin boundary indicating that something different happened. If a previous civilization went through its own industrial phase, its sediments might show a comparable blip, though with different materials, different fuels, and different technologies, the exact pattern would be unlike our own. They might have used energy sources we've barely considered, or processed materials that are rare or unfamiliar to us. If they developed synthetic compounds nature doesn't make on its own, those could serve as unmistakable markers, assuming they survive in some form. Reading sediment for such traces is slow, painstaking work. Each core sample is both a treasure and a puzzle. It offers a vertical slice through time with countless events layered on top of each other. The job is to separate the individual notes in what can look like a continuous hum. Scientists ask, are we seeing the fingerprint of changing climate alone, of geology, of biology? Or is there something extra, an overlay that doesn't comfortably fit any natural pattern we know? In some cases, we've already encountered anomalies, odd combinations of elements or shifts in isotopes that are not fully explained. Usually, further work reveals that they're tied to natural processes we didn't fully understand before. But it's not impossible that some of what we've cataloged as unusual but natural could, in a different interpretive frame, look more like deliberate impact. Part of the difficulty is that we can only recognize what we've learned to expect. Before the concept of plate tectonics, no one thought to interpret certain geological patterns as evidence of moving continents. Before we discovered radioactivity, the idea of using isotopes as clocks or tracers didn't exist. Likewise, if we don't yet have a mental category for chemical trace of a non-human civilization in deep time, we're unlikely to see it in the data. But our tools are improving. Analytical methods now can detect elements and compounds at levels that would have been invisible decades ago. Computer models can help distinguish what patterns are likely to arise naturally from those that would require some additional input. As we refine our ability to read sediments and cross-reference their contents with climate and fossil data, we might find patterns that stand out more clearly. Or we might find none at all. And that absence will also tell us something. Even the chemical record, though, is only a piece of the puzzle. To convince ourselves that an ancient civilization once existed, we'd want more than just unusual layers. We'd want those layers to line up with other evidence, shifts in species distributions, changes in erosion patterns, perhaps even fossil remains of the species itself. This brings us to one of the few formal scientific attempts to grapple with these questions, an effort to understand what, if anything, we should expect to see if an industrial civilization had come and gone long before ours. That effort has come to be known as the Silurian hypothesis. The Silurian hypothesis doesn't claim that such a civilization did exist. Instead, it asks, if it had, what would its fingerprints look like in the rocks? The name itself is borrowed from old science fiction. Decades ago, a television story imagined intelligent reptilian beings, dubbed Silurians, who evolved long before humans and later retreated underground. The scientists who proposed the hypothesis weren't suggesting those details were real. They chose the name as a playful nod to the idea of a pre-human intelligence. Their aim was serious, though. They wanted to know whether the geological record could, in principle, preserve evidence of something like our own industrial activity millions of years after it happened. To explore that, they started with the easiest case, us. We have already changed the composition of the atmosphere, particularly its carbon isotopes, in ways that are measurable and widespread. We've released novel compounds and redistributed metals. We've generated a global layer of plastics and other synthetic materials. If our species disappeared tomorrow, these changes would not reset instantly. They would be gradually incorporated into sediments, ice, and rock. Over millions of years, The plastics would degrade, many chemicals would transform, and many of the details would blur. But the broader signals, shifts in isotope ratios, unusual concentrations of certain elements, would likely remain detectable. From there, the question becomes, have we seen anything like this deeper in the record? The answer so far is, not anything that clearly requires a technological cause. There are times when carbon isotopes shift rapidly, when temperatures rise sharply, when certain metals appear more frequently in sediments. But these often coincide with events we can attribute to known natural causes, giant volcanic eruptions, methane releases, asteroid impacts. Still, the mere exercise of asking the question has value. It clarifies what kinds of evidence would be compelling and what kinds could be ambiguous. It reminds us that absence of evidence, especially in such an imperfect archive, is not the same as proof that nothing happened. It also throws an unexpected kind of light back onto our own situation. If, as the Silurian hypothesis suggests, a civilization like ours would leave a distinct but ultimately vulnerable signature in the rock, then we can see ourselves from a new angle, as just one possible phase in the planet's history, subject to erasure by the same slow forces that smoothed over everything before us. And that perspective, in turn, opens the door to one more layer of speculation. If intelligences have risen, flourished, and vanished here more than once, is that part of a broader pattern? Is Earth a place where cycles of civilization are not an anomaly, but a recurring theme? When people hear about the Silurian hypothesis, it can sound like a claim. There was a civilization before us. But that's not what it is. It's more like a thought experiment dressed in scientific language. Its originators didn't dig up a fossil city or uncover mysterious tools in ancient rock. They started instead from a broader question that also applies to other worlds. If a planet hosts an industrial civilization, what enduring marks does that leave? How would you recognize those marks 10 million or 100 million years later? The work blends climate science, geology, and a bit of astrophysical thinking. They noted that human industry has already begun to reconfigure Earth's systems. Greenhouse gas levels have shifted sharply. Nitrogen and phosphorus cycles have been altered by fertilizer use. Plastics and artificial chemicals have spread into soils and waterways. Radioactive fallout defines a narrow slice of recent time. Now imagine stacking rock layers on top of all that and waiting. The buildings vanish, the roads crumble, but the chemistry remains, folded into sediments. Even after long burial and transformation, some of those markers could survive in recognizable form. Could something similar have happened before? The hypothesis then asks how easy it would be to mistake such signals for purely natural phenomena. Volcanic eruptions, for example, can also spike greenhouse gases and distribute rare elements. Asteroid impacts can create sharp boundaries in the rock, rich in certain metals. Massive methane releases from seafloor deposits can alter carbon isotopes and trigger warming. At our current level of understanding, many strange events in the geological past can be tied to these known causes. Others are still debated, but none require the leap to ancient industry to make sense. From a strict scientific standpoint, the simplest explanation wins unless there's strong reason to prefer something more complex. But even as they lean toward natural explanations, the scientists behind the Silurian hypothesis point out that the record is imperfect and that certain kinds of evidence would be inherently hard to preserve. Direct artifacts, structures, tools, manufactured objects, are unlikely to last more than a few million years, let alone tens of millions. Chemical traces, while more durable, can be blurred or reset by heat and pressure. The older the suspected civilization, the thinner and more ambiguous any remaining evidence is likely to be. So the hypothesis doesn't conclude that there were predecessors. Instead, it draws a map of the terrain, what sorts of signatures we could look for, how confident we might be if we found them, and how easily they might be erased. In doing so, it quietly reframes how we see our own era. If an observer far in the future were to study Earth's rocks, they'd likely notice a sudden, sharp boundary in the strata corresponding to the time we're living through now. Carbon isotopes would swing in a distinctive way. Certain elements and compounds would abruptly increase. Fossil distributions would change, as species went extinct or shifted ranges. From their point of view, something unusual would have clearly happened. whether or not any recognizable artifacts survived. They might argue about whether it was a natural catastrophe, an industrial civilization, or something else. But they'd have data to work with. By contrast, if a civilization had existed here 200 million years ago, it would have left its traces in rocks that have since been cycled and altered to varying degrees. Its boundary layer, if it had one, might be broken up, buried under younger formations, or transformed by metamorphism. The deeper we look, the more we're trying to read through scorch marks and torn pages. That doesn't mean the question isn't worth asking. It means we shouldn't be surprised if the answer remains, we don't know. There's something oddly fitting about that. We're used to thinking of science as the business of turning unknowns into knowns. But some questions, by their nature, sit at the edge of what can be tested with the tools and data we have. The possibility of a pre-human civilization may always live in that edge zone. Not clearly true, not clearly false, but useful as a lens through which to think about Earth and about ourselves. Because ultimately, this isn't only a story about the past. It's also about patterns, about whether intelligence and civilization are one-off accidents or recurring possibilities in the life of a planet. If intelligence arose once, in us, perhaps that was an incredibly rare stroke of luck. If it arose more than once, perhaps the conditions that favor it appear whenever life is given enough time and stability. We don't yet know which is right, but we can explore what those conditions look like, how often they have occurred, and how long they tend to last. When we zoom out to this scale, human history stops being the centerpiece and becomes one chapter among many potential others. Our rise has been rapid on the geological timescale, our impact enormous. But rapid changes often come with instability. If civilizations are indeed part of Earth's long story, their pattern may not be a steady climb toward ever greater complexity, but a series of bursts, each one rising, transforming the planet, and fading, leaving behind traces of varying clarity. That idea brings us slowly back to ourselves. It invites us to ask, what does it actually take for a civilization not just to arise, but to endure? And are we on a path that leads toward endurance, or toward becoming one more thin, mysterious layer for future minds to puzzle over? Those questions tie together everything we've been imagining, from the first spark of intelligence in distant ages to our own moment under the stars tonight. And they're questions best held not as sources of dread, but as companions, reminders that we inhabit a world much older and more intricate than we often remember, and that what we choose to do with our time here truly matters. When we talk about cycles of civilizations, it's tempting to picture a simple loop: rise, flourish, fall, repeat. But if intelligence has appeared more than once on Earth, the reality is probably far messier, more like overlapping waves than neatly repeated patterns. Intelligence by itself shows up in many places. Civilization, intelligence scaled up into long-term, cooperative, technology-using culture, is another matter. It's that combination of clever minds, shared knowledge, and tools that transform the environment on a planetary scale. Looking back over the last 500 million years, we see that evolution is full of repeated breakthroughs. Eyes evolved multiple times in different lineages. Flight emerged in insects, pterosaurs, birds, and bats independently. Complex social behavior appears in ants, primates, whales, and others. These parallels suggest that certain solutions are attractive to evolution whenever conditions favor them. If vision and flight can come up again and again, perhaps civilization, in some form, can as well. But unlike eyes or wings, civilization depends heavily on context. The environment has to be stable enough to allow cultures to grow, yet dynamic enough to push minds toward innovation. There must be available energy sources, accessible materials, and ecological space for a species to expand without immediately destabilizing its own support systems. Even when those conditions exist, the path from sophisticated animal society to tool-using, world-altering civilization may be narrow. It might require a rare combination of traits: high intelligence, complex communication, fine physical control over the environment, and long lifespans or strong cultural continuity so that knowledge can accumulate. We know that combination came together once in our lineage. Whether it happened earlier with some other species remains unknown. If it did, their story would almost certainly have included the same broad challenges we face: balancing growth against limited resources, managing the side effects of powerful technologies, weathering natural disasters, and dealing with internal conflicts that can tear a society apart. Civilizations don't just fall because of external catastrophes. They can also overextend, exhaust their resource base, or become too rigid to adapt when conditions change. On Earth, major extinction events sometimes reset the board. After each mass die-off, new forms of life tend to radiate into the emptied ecological niches. It's not impossible that intelligence might be one of the traits that evolution explores repeatedly in these periods of renewal. In that sense, a mass extinction could wipe out one civilization and simultaneously sow the seeds for another far in the future. Seen this way, intelligence and civilization might not be a singular summit, but a recurring possibility, a pattern woven into the long story of life. That thought shifts the meaning of our current moment. If we are just one of several possible civilizations a planet can host, then we are part of a larger pattern we can barely glimpse. Our successes and failures may rhyme with stories that played out long before we arrived and may echo into stories that will unfold long after we're gone. At the same time, our actions are not trivial. We occupy a unique position, aware of our impact, able to study deep time, capable of imagining futures beyond our own lifetimes. A hypothetical civilization hundreds of millions of years ago, if it existed, might never have had the chance to look back with the clarity we have now. It might not have known how fragile its place was until it was too late. We, on the other hand, can see some of the pressures gathering around us: climate change, biodiversity loss, resource limits. We are in a position to decide whether to push harder against those limits or to adapt to them. From a geological point of view, every civilization faces the same question: how long can you keep your layer thin? The thicker and more abrupt the layer, the more rapid and extreme the changes you impose, the more likely it is that your story ends sharply. The thinner the layer, the more carefully your impacts blend with natural cycles, the greater the chance your civilization can stretch out across time. It's possible that any predecessors we imagine answered that question one way. Perhaps they grew quickly, burned bright, and left behind a sharp, thin boundary layer before the Earth carried on without them. We are, right now, in the process of choosing our own answer. When we imagine future geologists, whether human descendants or some entirely new intelligent species, studying the rocks we leave behind, it's worth wondering what kind of story our layer will tell. Will it look like a brief, violent disruption followed by a long recovery, suggesting a civilization that burned through its options too quickly? Or will it show a more gradual, moderated pattern? Changes, yes, but ones that eventually level off, indicating a society that learned how to live within its planet's limits? Those possibilities aren't abstract. They're being shaped by decisions made in the present. How we generate energy, how we use land and water, how we treat other species, how we respond to warning signs from the climate and biosphere. In that sense, thinking about the idea of prior civilizations isn't just a nostalgic look back. It's a tool for thinking forward. If we can imagine others who rose and fell, we can more easily imagine our own fall, and perhaps, more importantly, imagine ways to avoid or soften it. We can ask, if another civilization had managed to survive for millions of years without catastrophic collapse, what might they have done differently? They might have chosen energy sources that didn't destabilize their climate. They might have kept their populations and consumption in balance with the ecosystems they depended on. They might have prioritized long-term resilience over short-term expansion. We don't know if anyone ever achieved that on Earth before us, but we do know that for the first time, a species exists here that can consciously aim for it. That realization moves the conversation from, did someone else come first, 2. What kind of ancestors do we want to be for whatever comes next? Whether or not there are future minds to read our layer, whether or not they can decipher who we were, we are still writing a chapter in the planet's autobiography. How we write it, in stone, in chemistry, in the living systems that share the world with us, is still, for the moment, up to us. And that brings us back, gently, to the present. To this one stretch of time where we can think about the deep past, imagine distant futures, and still have some influence over the only era we actually inhabit. For all the vastness of Earth's history and all the speculation about what might have been, the most tangible part is here, now, with us. We are the current caretakers of a planet that has hosted more experiments in life than we can count. We get to decide whether our own experiment ends in a sudden line in the rocks or in a quieter, more enduring presence. We may never know for sure whether there were civilizations before us, but we can choose what kind of civilization we are while we're here. In the end, perhaps that's the most important part of the question. Not who came first, but what we do with the time we've been given.